Good morning and welcome. We have not only a very exciting agenda this morning, but we also have some very special people who have traveled a long way to participate in our panel. So I would like to thank Professor Vijay Gupta for having really organized this wonderful panel, and also to keep us focused on some of the trigger questions that we will share with you. Professor Vijay Gupta is Professor Emeritus of Civil Engineering here at the university. He has a specialty in geophysics in water, but he also has a very strong and wide experience in collaborative research with people from many different disciplines. And now he is transcending this experience to today's theme of the conference and of this session, which is broadening the scientific framework to bring ancient civilization, wisdom, science, and into the Western mind frame.
We are going to get started. Holden, would you please flip the next slide? Okay, so we have put together for you 4 sets of resources. One is the movie we showed on Sunday. Many of you were there. If you missed that, you can watch it in your own time. It's a legacy. David Suzuki is not a stranger to sustainability. I think he is one of the world names from Canada. He's godfather of sustainability that Canada has produced. So I will urge you to watch his legacy movie called The Force of Nature. The second is we are going to show you a 5-minute video right here. The video is very beautiful. It gives you the sense of discussion that have been going on, the indigenous worldview versus Western worldview. So please start the video.
How we see the world determines how we act. The Western philosopher Hobbes saw humans as engaged in a war with each other over resources, making our lives solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. This view of the individual, fearful, working alone, in competition with others, now dominates Western philosophical tradition. In indigenous philosophy, we are all related as individuals, as part of a kinship-based community, and as part of nature, in balance with the whole. In most Western thought, society is seen as an aggregate of self-interested individuals, connected by competition with each other over limited resources, creating fear, insecurity, hopelessness, a scarcity of spirit. Indigenous societies see prosperity in nature. Resources are abundant, shared. Collaboration fosters environmental stewardship and balance with nature. In the Western worldview, nature is feared, its value based on hierarchy. Everything on Earth ranked, mineral, plant, animal, with humans at the top, dominating everything below. In the indigenous worldview, humans are an equal part of a vibrant, interconnected whole. 2 worldviews, 2 very different economic systems. The dominant Western market economy, like its worldview, driven by an assumption of scarce resources, intensive centralized production, individuals with insatiable appetites, accumulating. By this standard, the market economy works. 40% of the Earth's resources owned by just 1% of the population. The combined wealth of the 3 richest individuals in the world exceeds the GDP of the poorest 47 countries. The world contains only 497 multi-billionaires, while half of its population survives on less than $2.50 a day. The indigenous economy, like its worldview, interdependent, decentralized production, extensive use of resources, promoting responsible resource management, abundance, kinship, a belief in enoughness, encourages sharing and cooperation. In the Arctic, after a successful whale hunt, Inuit kinship and reciprocal obligations ensure everyone's needs are met, fairly and equitably. Prerequisites for sustainability: the health of the economy measured by the health of the whole. Health in the market economy measured by gross domestic product. The more we produce, consume, the better the economy. Construction of buildings, manufacturing, transportation, all considered positive production, but so is production of weapons, cigarettes, while investments like healthcare, education are considered costs, negative economic productivity. And the impact on GDP of the physical and emotional costs of warfare, or the pollution that threatens 1/3 of the world's animal species? Irrelevant externalities outside the system. Not even making it onto the balance sheet. An unsustainable system where scarcity of resources is a self-fulfilling prophecy. There is an alternative. Indigenous peoples' territory spans 24% of the Earth's land surface, but is home to 80% of its total biodiversity. This is not a coincidence. In indigenous cultures, balance and harmony aren't romantic notions, but millennia-old design fundamentals. Nature essential for survival, production and protection together, economic success sustainable, creating well-being for all. First Peoples funds indigenous models and traditional practices that offer insights to creating an alternative economy which promotes balance with nature and communal harmony.
Okay, thank you. So this is the second resource. The third, is a conference that John Kinnaman has organized with India, and there's a website there, so that we will put on our website here, or it may already be there. So I'm going to skip that, but it's very important. Is science able to explain the scientists? You all scientists, whatever science you practice, is it able to explain who you are? And finally, there's an opinion letter that was put together through efforts, 3 of us, myself, Indira, in the audience, and a colleague from South America, Colombia, and that we have put. It's a published paper in Ancient Science, a peer-reviewed journal. It is on the ISSS website under panel 6, so you can download a short paper, 3 pages. Okay, so these are the resources for our panel discussion that we have put together. The next is, we have assembled 4 trigger questions, and so these are the questions. They will stay on the screen as the panelists respond to them. And after that, there's a procedure that Dominique.
Yes, so here's how we'd like to proceed. Each panelist will briefly introduce him or herself by stating our name, affiliation, and field of specialty. We're only going to spend 1 or 2 minutes because we really want to focus on discussion. And then each panel person will answer the trigger questions one at a time. We really need to respect the timing of this session because we do need to be out of here at 12:15 promptly, so we'll try to adhere to that. Once all the pre-planned questions have been addressed by the panelists, then whatever time is left, hopefully at least 30 minutes, we will take question and answers from the audience. So I'm going to put the slide back on the trigger questions so that you can follow them with us.
Thank you. Okay, so the first trigger question for the panel, and whoever you can organize yourself. You each does not have to speak if you don't want to, but if you wish to, you speak. You have, looking at the time, about 15 minutes of time to answer first question. The question is, what was David Suzuki's legacy message? If you're supposed to have watched the movie, so panel.
Hello, I'm Bruce Milne. I'm a professor of biology at the University of New Mexico. I direct the Sustainability Studies program there. I'm an ecologist, a landscape ecologist, and it's somewhat pertinent that I grew up in central New York, which is a completely different environment than many other places, and moved to New Mexico 30 years ago. My answer to this question is very brief. I think that the film reviewed David's life and his experiences, and some were traumatic beginnings as the Japanese people, American citizens, were persecuted and sequestered away during World War II because of Pearl Harbor. And that sort of trauma alerted him to all kinds of labeling that happens in our society, the separation of people. But ultimately, he recovered from that by engaging himself in the world of nature, and he sees an incredible richness to that connection. So to finish my analysis of this very briefly, he left us at the end of the film knowing that the world is in a crisis, but he turns his attention towards the positive potential of humanity and gives us permission, I think, to find that positivity and to act upon it because we consciously can move in that direction.
My name's Rudy Miick. I'm based here in Boulder, Colorado. My family is 5 generations Colorado, born in Steamboat. And at the same time, I was raised in Hawaii, so had the opportunity to, as a big white guy, to feel what it's like to be raised as a minority. So that's a story in itself. My work, actually, I'm not an academic. I actually own a number of companies that are focused on organizational change, growth, leadership development, and what makes our work, I would like to think, unique or certainly effective is that we work from definitive values, using values as verbs instead of nouns, having a sense of purpose, and holding the I and the we, not just the I. So I'll leave it at that and look forward to answering the questions in a bit.
Sangaherindi. My name is Greg Cajete. I'm from Santa Clara Pueblo, which is just the next state over. And it's really a pleasure to have this opportunity to share some thoughts and perspectives from my viewpoint and my experience. David Suzuki, I think, is one of the premier ecological philosophers, I guess you might say, and very much as Bruce has mentioned, has been, I think, one of the people who has really influenced, I think, the thinking of modern science and scientists, towards that sustainability view and that indigenous view, if you will, because of his own experience. Again, I come from Santa Clara Pueblo. I've lived all of my life in New Mexico. And currently I'm the director of the Native American Studies program at the university. I also worked for a period of time at the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe. And both experiences have been very interesting in my own journey. I began as a field biologist way back in the day when you actually trained as a general scientist in biology. And there were two tracks, one for field and the other one for lab. Okay, and so I got my undergraduate training at New Mexico Highlands University. But I ended up being a science teacher. And so this perspective of understanding where the indigenous fits into this dialogue began very early for me at the Institute of American Indian Arts, where I was actually asked by the president at that time to create a curriculum that integrated science with art, with the cultural perspectives of the students that were attending the Institute at that time. So that immediately, even before the word sustainability was coming up in the literature or indigenous was coming up in the literature, and I'm talking about 1973, 1974, when I was developing curriculum that helped to give a broader understanding of science to students, and yet also bridge the gaps between the cultural worldviews, Western and indigenous. So I'll leave it at that, but that's kind of my background. I'm also a practicing artist and am very grounded, I think, in at least the applications of systems theory to education. And so that's what I probably will talk about, yeah.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Nancy Maraboy, and I currently live in the San Juan Islands. And so when you look at the David Suzuki film, except the mountains are a little higher up in Haida Gwaii, I have that same water and beautiful water and air around me. I'm the president of the Indigenous Education Institute, which is an all-native nonprofit corporation that's been in existence about 25 years. I have a PhD in Indigenous science, which both David and I do, which is an unusual one you won't have heard about too much, but that's what it is. I'm a part-time faculty at Northern Arizona University in the Department of Physics and Astronomy, and I was at Dene College for many years in Arizona, our tribal college. I'm Navajo and Cherokee. Most of our work is funded by National Science Foundation and to an increasing amount by NASA. We work in that nexus, that area that's like a border town almost, where two systems are colliding together, the indigenous ways of knowing and the Western scientific ways of knowing. And although it can be hard and difficult, it's also the place where a lot of transformational change can take place. So I look forward to this dialogue with you all today. Thank you.
David Begay. I come from the Navajo country, from the Navajo Nation, a member of the nation. I am pretty much retired. Just wanted to go fishing one day, and I visited my University of New Mexico Department of College of Pharmacy, and they wanted to recruit me. So I went back to work, and now associate research professor there, and also vice president to the Indigenous Education Institute that Nancy mentioned. Nonprofit organization. We work with NASA and National Science Foundation that she mentioned. Also been teaching at Northern Arizona University in the Department of Physics and Astronomy for a long time, and that's my professional life. I was raised by the culture and the deep knowledge, and was raised by my elders. They're renowned, and so I also retain that language. That's my first language. English is my second language, and so most of my knowledge comes from the indigenous side. And so whenever these topics are talked about, I process all my information through my indigenous mind and try to interpret that into English. Sometimes they don't quite go together, but try to work out something. I guess as far as the question is concerned, David Suzuki's message, I think he's telling us a lot, that we need to live in harmony and in balance with the world. And we need to ask the right questions. And sometimes we don't ask the right questions. And one thing that struck me was he was talking about his view. And he said that I am the environment. I think this is very common to a lot of the indigenous worldview, that everything is holistic. The whole universe is holistic, and the human is just a mere participant. We're not separate from the world. We're not separate from Earth. We're not separate from the universe. We're an integral part of it. And so that was his message. And so what he was saying, I could really relate to it. And I immediately could process in my mind what he was talking about. And so that was my connection to the film. The other thing that he talked about was the Japanese persecution during World War II. It's very much similar to the Native American experience. Native people were persecuted, removed by force, put on the reservations, and they were also forced to get rid of their language, their culture, their whole way of life. A lot of the things that we're going to be talking about here today, the indigenous worldview, to completely eliminate that, and complete acculturation, assimilation by force. And government put a lot of money into it. And so that's where I could relate. But it survived. The United States government, came to the Navajo when they needed codes, secret codes to fight the Japanese, and so they relied on the Navajo language. They developed a secret code, and so that language was used in that way. And so I guess we eventually contribute in some other way, in a good way. It's a good thing that the language survived. And so just wanted to say this much for now.
Thank you. I'm Dominique Surel. I have an MBA and a doctoral degree in organizational leadership. I teach intuitive intelligence, critical thinking, and leadership. I do a lot of lectures internationally and workshops under an umbrella title that I call Human Potential, with the view to hopefully evolve the human consciousness. So I think David Suzuki's message is obviously very clear to everyone. He has a very poetic way of communicating this message, which is that our so-called modern or evolved society, we've actually evolved into a paradigm that has lost sight of common sense, and meaning that we are operating as a separate entity from our planet, on which we live on and depend on for food and our future. And his message is that although it may seem difficult to collaborate and work together holistically for a solution, we are all, at the end of the day, human beings. And I think that's the message he's giving to us, in that we should look back at the indigenous cultures who, you know, how did they develop their paradigms? Well, I think through instinct and realizing the fact that they had to survive in harmony with our planet. So.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Now we move on to second trigger question.
No. Yes, please answer the first question. Thank you.
Okay. I was really interested in the Suzuki story and have been for a while. And what I'm coming away with is what he said toward the end of his film. He said, we have exhausted the limits of the biosphere. It is imperative that we rethink our relationship with the natural world. I would say that's a real guiding principle for David and I in our work with Indigenous Education Institute. We work around the world with a lot of different tribes, and most of it is focused on how can you speak of the Western way of knowing, which arguably is based on Western science, and the indigenous ways. And we started out by really doing what we call juxtapositions. We would have one on one side of the screen, one on the other. And we found that Native people were very, very interested in knowing this because they had had a Western education slapped on top of them. But then it made them feel they understood where they were. Well, when we showed it to non-Native people, they got very uncomfortable and somewhat angry about it. So over many, many years, we have readapted it. When we talk to Native people, we still do what we did before to make it really clear which part is coming from which worldview. But now we are working to actually transform the world, if you will. And one of the ways we are doing it is what David Suzuki was illustrating in terms of making allies. So as Indigenous people, we're focused on making allies in the non-Indigenous world. And how can making people more aware of the Native perspective and how it can have some interplay with the Western way of knowing, even the economy system. That's what most of our work is all about. I was really taken by how he, later in life, wove his life in with the people of Haida Gwaii, the Haida people, and how he became, I think his family's closely related to them now, and how he saw in that tribe a way of living that illustrated where he was coming from and what he found to be answers for the big problems of the world. This is really similar to something that happened to David Bohm when he was introduced to Native people about in the early 90s, and we've been part of that group since then, where he said, all of my life I've been writing in the quantum realm, and now I've met a people who actually live it. So those are two really good examples of people who were able to take what they were learning from Indigenous people and apply it to their own work. And for us, it was just the opposite, but very complementary. We found that we had the best way we could describe the Navajo way of knowing, and we did it in our dissertation. We wrote a collaborative dissertation showing that two ways, a male and a female viewpoint together, made a whole. And when we did it, we found that translating the Navajo words into English, the best words we could find in English came from the field of systems thinking, systems theory. And that's where we got really interested in what systems theory had to offer in terms of two ways coming together, and maybe this will provide a way to go ahead into the future that won't be as destructive and damaging. And I just want to close this little series of remarks by saying I have a little streak of Irish in me, and that part is also a fifth generation Colorado. Irish, to be white and Irish in those days was to be really discriminated. You were the worst of the worst. And so even my own father didn't know he had any Irish blood in him at all till he was just almost ready to pass away because it was hidden. But on my native side, on the Navajo side, I'm a clan called Senjakini, which means honeycomb rock cliff dwellers, which goes back to Greg's country. And there are stories that say that 2,000 years ago, those people from my heritage were living on the San Juan River, which is where I lived for many, many years. So it's a big cycle. What goes around comes around.
My takeaway from David's film matches really what's been said. The nuance that I would put on this is not being an academic, more so a pragmatic business person, dare I call myself that, is one of holding the both and, rather than either or. Is if I'm opening a business, if a value is community, then what is the action of outreach into that community? If the value is a good life for me, for each of us, how is a good life produced for all of us? So, and I was really struck with Suzuki's use of the test tube as well with bacteria and the finite sense of resource. So rather than working in a world of only ideation or the application of those ideas, it's been both exciting and frustrating to actuate or do our best to actuate what was in the film, to hold both quantum and Newtonian physics, to hold the both and of that again. And without rambling, I'll just stop there. To me, it is holding both.
Thank you again. The second trigger question is, what is the indigenous ancient worldview in contrast to the modern scientific industrial worldview? We have shown you a 5-minute video. We request the panel to share their perspective, their insights.
Well, I won't speak for the indigenous view at all, and I'm going to cast a dark shadow over the Western scientific approach to things, which I am going to amplify mostly as a counterpoint to what I suspect we're going to hear otherwise. So, I'm a full professor. I've been up through the whole deal, and I would say that the scientific culture is exactly what the cartoon of Western society is about. I mean, yes, there's lots of collaboration, but think about what Mila was saying. We live in this society of punishment and reward. That is a very central aspect of science and academia especially. So, grad students are schooled in graduate school to sit in a seminar and basically learn how to read other people's scientific papers and go at them viciously until they find the flaws, and rarely go out the door thinking, wow, that was an amazing thing. These are top-notch papers, and you're looking for the flaws all the time. So it's to say that other people are assumed to be wrong in some way, and we're not accepting of the benefits that people are trying to put out there in many ways. I mean, obviously, these are scientists doing their very best work, and isn't it worthy of being accepted for its positive contribution? Everyone understands that there's flaws or limitations of work. And, the other thing about Western science is that there's tremendous hubris. So I've grown up my whole life hearing that we're going to cure cancer. I would say that's just a conceit to keep the money flowing into NIH, because we sure as heck want to do more of that. So, we now know that cancer is not just anything that's going to be solved with a magic bullet. That's a completely wrong model. We need a systems model, a holism model about the environment that allows cancer, right? And I know Thomas is going to agree with me. So what do we have? We have a kind of what I might call scientific Darwinism at play. So in Darwinian theory, what you would do is create an excess of highly educated folks who have PhDs, i.e. more than there are jobs. You would put them in an environment with scant resources. So right now, I've been on panels, selecting, or actually on panels with the National Science Foundation, USDA, to select the winners. Who's going to win the competition for grant money. And I can tell you, you walk in the door, you're on this big panel with your peers, you're going to review 120 proposals about sustainable agriculture, and the first thing they tell you is that we're going to give money to 10 people, 10 projects out of 120. So the scarcity of resources is the environment in which these luminous scientists who have been doing this stuff forever and are fully capable of this research, they're in an environment of scarce resources. So what happens? Some of them survive. And at this point, since about a third of them are fully qualified proposals, you're basically having a lottery, and somebody wins the lottery and goes home with the money. So those are the ones that go back to their university. Their dean says, congratulations, you brought in all this money. You're the best, you're the fittest, and you survive. That's the model. It's extremely toxic. And there are scientists out there that say, forget that. And James Lovelock is a great example. He's self-funded his whole career. He's independent of that whole thing. And what is his product of his research is the Gaia hypothesis, along with Lynn Margulis. The Gaia hypothesis is a holistic view of the world. And it came from a scientist who rejects the Western scientific culture and model and the scarcity mentality and the Darwinism of it all. So forgive me, I hope I painted a cartoon. I mean, I'm one of those people, right? I came up through the whole system, and I've done it all. I've won the grant awards many, many times. So I know, what works and what doesn't work and how to play the game. But it's a terrible thing to throw a young human being into, to train them up and wish them well.
Thanks for that, Bruce. I love I'm left with, so how do we change the game? Right? How do we change the game? Two things strike me with this film. One, as from my academic background with in the world of work and in Gestalt and yoga and education as a whole, I'm struck with, I think I knew the information in that 5-minute film, and at the same time I'm hit like a brick with education and growth is seen as a cost. So that's one of the takeaways from me this morning and the gift of this room, so thank you. I'm also touched to be on this panel. I think my answer needs to come from a very quick personal story. I'm old enough that I was raised in Hawaii, went to Hawaii 5 years before it was a state. And I can remember as a little kid going to downtown Honolulu, and there would be people walking in the banking district and downtown in suits with briefcases and barefoot. And I was a senior in high school before I was made to wear shoes. We used to get barefoot passes. Right? We would stub our toes so we wouldn't have to wear shoes. At the same time, I was 6 feet tall by the time I was in 7th grade, and I went to schools where there were 28 white kids called haulis. And I was in a fight every day for every day of middle school, what is called their intermediate school, literally for no other reason than I was a haole. I share this story because most of us in the room, I'm gonna make up another story, most of us know the word aloha. It's commonly translated as hello, goodbye, love. The actual root, as many indigenous languages, the language itself has power and meaning. So aloha actually means one with breath. And ha'oli actually means one without breath. So here comes Cook, and basically the story in Hawaii is no different than very, very similar than to many of the indigenous tribal stories, sadly, that are in the mainland United States. And without all the hows or the whys, I graduated from high school, and I would have to say that I was pretty much a consummate racist. And for whatever reason, ended up in Birmingham, Alabama. I graduated in 1967, and I go to Birmingham, Alabama, Jackson, Mississippi, right through the South, and the bathrooms are still segregated with signs. In Hawaii, I got kicked out of bathrooms, but there was at least no signs. Were at least no signs. And literally in a millisecond, my life changed because all of a sudden I was in power and didn't know what to do. And I could hide. It was just crazy. Those were challenging times, and now I look back and what a gift. What an incredible gift. So what I'm struck with this piece of indigenousness and West is how do we collaborate? And from Suzuki's movie to this piece, both, instead of us proselytizing or lecturing or being an evangelical, how do we witness? How do we simply put business models in place that hold the abundance rather than the scarcity? And what I can say to that is that I've had my companies now for 36, we're in our 37th year, and what used to be 30 years ago craziness, 2 years ago we started winning awards as visionaries, my company. It's like, what changed? Nothing's changed. We saw values, we saw the worth of the balance of I and we, the balance of, okay, so I do a lot of work in the restaurant business, and it's interesting that they showed the fishing, right? So here's bluefin, here's ahi, here's mahi-mahi, here's whatever fish are in any other game. How do we choose as business people, as owners, even though the public may not be educated, how do we say, no, we're not purchasing that product, even though we know we can sell it? That becomes a fundamental choice. And I'll stop with, I think actually much of the solution for us is, in addition to these amazing academic models and the process of actually working with indigenous peoples and communities, is in the world of business, how do we actually show up and say, isn't it interesting if, I'll use one example, the median net profit in the average restaurant in the United States, pick any restaurant in Boulder, median net profit is 3%. The books are closed. The owner at the top gets a lot. And we're fighting over minimum wage. Here's the shortness. With open books, with profit sharing, with values in action, our average client makes 17% return with lower turnover. And minimum wage is a non sequitur because everybody wins. And I'll stop there, but thank you.
I'm the time manager, and John Kinnaman has just, where is John Kinnaman? As president of ISSS, he said, you have to draw the line on time. So that's what I'm trying to do. So we have about 25 minutes.
I just answered all 4 questions, so I'm done.
Okay, so we, 3 and 4 are really linked, these 2 questions. So I'm going to read both of them and then leave it to the panel to address. I will start with question 4. that how do we incorporate ancient and indigenous wisdom and science into currently exploding new field of sustainability science. The fact that ISSS has arranged this meeting focusing on this theme. So you will have time during the
Touche.
Yes, thank you. Could we just finish that question with these panelists here who didn't get a chance? And then once we finish question 2, perhaps we can combine question 3 and 4 together as we go around again. I think that may be the most effective, if you don't mind. Thank you. So question 2.
Okay, real quickly, when you juxtapose indigenous worldview with science and industrial worldview, I think they're like apple and oranges to me. They're really different. When you go into the mind of the indigenous world, earlier I was saying that everything is interconnected. Everything works together. You know, that's what you see when you look through the lens of the indigenous mind. Nothing is independent. It's one universe acting. So if I take something like this piece of paper, in our language, when we talk about gravity, for example, you know, we don't take this and look at it like using Einstein's equation. You know, we can, we don't apply it mathematical formula or the scientific formula. You know, what indigenous people, our people that I know, they said, what you see here is not determined by numbers. You know, what you see here is the whole universe acting. You know, it's holistic. You know, it's numbers are too simple. You know, try to use the whole universe to explain this. You know, that's a different kind of, you know, way of looking at, you know, gravity, or to talk about gravity, you know, at work. And so it's all verb-based when you go into the indigenous mind. It's emotion, process. You know, when you go in English, it's noun-based. You know, it's different. I think you have to look at everything that's out there whenever you talk about anything. You know, Bruce mentioned cancer. You know, when you talk about cancer, you have to connect it to the environment. I think it's the same thing. You know, our people talk about this. It's ancient wisdom and ancient knowledge. They say that, you know, when your air gets sick, you're going to get sick. When your water gets sick, you're going to get sick. When your land gets sick, you're going to get sick. And so, you know, you have to look at your situation as it relates to the environment. You have to define it, you know, holistically, not independently. So that's the worldview. Science, you know, there's different definition. The way I see it, it's largely defined by the schools, you know, used in the K-12 schools and the universities and federal agencies, National Science Foundation, the National Institute of Mental Health, and NASA, and some of the other federal agencies. And a lot of time it's, you know, based on the scientific methods and inquiries. To me, you know, I don't put any value judgment on that. It's just a tool, you know, the way I look at it. It's just a way of, you know, getting information. In the science world, everything is processed through subject-object, you know, formula. You know, for example, water. You know, the science world, you put it over there. In the native world, you know, you're connected to that water. That water is life. In the science world, you even give it, you know, a scientific name: hydrogen, oxygen. And so you know, it's the method, you know, makes that separation. So in the native world, they say that, you know, words, all it does is it separates the wholeness. That's all it does, words. You know, one word that comes out of your mouth, you know, you start the dissection. In your mind, you can mentally feel, you know, the holisticness of all things. But you try to talk about it. One word that comes out, you start, you know, tearing it apart. You know, no language has been, you know, developed, you know, as far as I know, you know, they can talk that language. So I think, you know, we have to go higher, you know, if we're going to talk about another level of intellectual knowledge. You know, and so that's in the indigenous mind, you know, that's the language, you know, talks that language. And so language is not based on formula, you know, it's live. You know, one of my colleague from Alaska, Miick, he's a biologist too, and one time he said that, you know, that, you know, Einstein's, you know, equation E equals mc squared, and we do it all the time. You know, whenever we're going to go hunt seal, you know, what we do is we take our stick, and we need to find out how, if the water is frozen enough. We got a measuring stick. That's scientific. You know, that tells us it's okay to go out there. And he says, once you get going, there's a rhythm you have to walk. Otherwise, you're going to fall in. He says 7 seconds before you become frozen, just like that. So it's a matter of life and death. And so, you know, you work with the rhythm. Otherwise, you fall down. Deep, you know, focused concentration. You get out there, hunt your seal, get your food, then you come back, you know. And so, rather than talking about these things in the equation, you know, we live it. And so it's just another way of looking at, you know, talking about E equals mc squared. Anyway, that's, you know, what he was talking about. I think as far as industry is concerned, I think, you know, that speaks for itself. You know, it's mechanistic. You know, it's all about production. The more the better, and I'll end here.
When Vijay stands up, that means something's going to happen. Okay, I'll just be brief here. It's really hard to describe these things from an indigenous perspective when you have very little time. And we can talk about a lot of different subjects here, but without a real context to put them in, it's hard to really make a connection. I do want to say that we are already making change just by the very fact of this panel being held, and it's expressive of several different worldviews. I think that 25 years ago, David and Greg and I wouldn't have been at the table, and that shows me there is some real progress that is happening. I just want to mention a couple of things that I think might apply to the question. David's been talking about interrelationships. I know David Suzuki mentioned interdependencies. We talk about interrelationships. It's all that idea that everything in the universe is connected. And I liked what David Suzuki was talking about, the air. What we're breathing in this room today has been breathed 10,000 years ago. And so what you're breathing, I'm breathing, you're breathing, we're all in this together. There's a finite amount of water. There's a finite amount of air. This is the time we have to act, I think. When I'm standing on San Juan Island looking at the Salish Sea, Puget Sound, and I have a Lummi elder standing by me, and he's saying, "This is a dead sea." It brought tears to my eyes to have them saying this. He doesn't mean it's totally dead, but it's almost there. This is tragic. We're living in such a fast-paced world where things are going extinct every minute. And then here's the indigenous way that I think we believe really strongly has a recipe for success, for keeping the world and the whole universe in balance. I think we use words like reciprocity. It's really important. What you do is going to influence something else, and then that thing in turn is going to influence you. This is something Native people try to live every day, that sense of reciprocity. Ceremonies are built on it. Families are built on it. Education is built on it. Another one is the concept of stewardship. When David and I first started meeting with NASA a lot of years ago, we would be talking along, and all of a sudden we mentioned the concept of stewardship. It just blew them away. They had never stopped to think that by putting the ashes of a man on the moon, that it was totally offending Native people when it was a pristine object that should stay pure and be a inspiration to people. And the idea of looking ahead 7 generations, making your business decisions, all your decisions for your great-great-grandchildren, and looking back 7 generations to the people that suffered and died through the Long Walk or the Cherokee Trail of Tears, they did that for us. So it's that long-term planning. These are things I think are really important for people all over the world to take into consideration. These are values of Native people. To see the world in terms of totally always continually moving, the process of things, and then the relationship of those things that are in the process. Those are things that are built into the Native language. And although we're talking about Navajo language, it can be, a lot of these values are shown in other Native languages too. But the idea of everything is in motion, the idea that everything's a verb, like several people have said. Take the idea of paradox. Paradox is an inherent indigenous way of seeing the world. Paradox does not mean a polarity. This is a really important concept. It's not a continuum with one thing over here and one thing over here, like light and dark. It's more a paradox, which means you can hold both of those concepts in one hand or one basket. And I think that, too, has a lot of... It could be very important as we try to think of how a new world order could come about. That idea of thinking instead of polarities, which is where Britain and the United States are just rushing headlong into this system of polarities. Think of the politics. And then the idea of backing up, putting your arms around a huge system and thinking in terms of paradox. Then, and I'm thinking of the way Vijay organized this panel, starting with David Suzuki, as something that brought all of us together, so we wouldn't just introduce ourselves and go off on a tangent, but so we all had something of a foundation to speak from. So I thank you for that.
In my language, Tewa, the word for breath is ha. And when we give a greeting, we say, Newa gipoa ha haotse etoma, which means, here we have come together and we're looking to share our breath with each other. Our term for teaching or learning is ihao, to breathe in. And so the indigenous languages, of course, are replete with terms that bring to your mind, the focus of what you're doing and in that process. And so I'm going to speak to you as a teacher, and all of you are teachers here. You all teach science in some shape or form. You have graduate students, you have research you're doing with them, you're teaching courses of various types. Some you like, some you don't like, probably. And it's important, I think, to begin to think about indigenous ways of knowing as ways that are ancient. They're tried and true. They're based on a huge generational experience with life and with places. And that we're at a point in time where education is both the medium and the message, both the problem and also the solution. In the context of the work I do as an educator, and also especially looking at the creative process of developing curriculum that actually work for students and actually solve problems that incorporate science and indigenous thought simultaneously as two tools, two modes of thinking, that as teachers, you have the opportunity in the work that you do as professors to really affect some changes immediately. First of all, by looking at how you teach and what you teach. Looking at engaging the curriculum that you yourself are a part of, and beginning to take a look at it in terms of how do you bring in other viewpoints, other ways of knowing, other ways of viewing the world that are both multicultural, multi-indigenous. How do you begin to think about the work that you do, what you teach the students, what skills you give them? Most of our education and most of our university level teaching is totally outmoded and has been for decades. We haven't kept up as professors with most of what we know to be good education based on our own research in terms of how the brain actually operates. It's based on natural learning, and much of what indigenous education was always about was connecting to natural ways of learning things. And so we have to begin to sort of, using now the research that we do have, to begin to reinvent the ways of education towards this sustainability focus. I believe as an educator, everything in education must move towards the notion of sustainability. So that question, whether it's at the macro level or the micro level, really has to be the engaging question of the time and also of the process of education. So I talk to you as science teachers in the sense that you have the opportunity with this next generation of students, with the students that you have now, to begin to make some significant changes in the way that they think about themselves and also about the world around them. To be not so exclusive, essentially. The scientific worldview essentially is a worldview that, yes, it's based on Western thought and Western tradition and Western worldview. It's the archetype of that view. But the inclusivity of science itself, the process, the creative process of science, it has an inclusivity that we have to engage, once again, both within ourselves, and the way you do it as a teacher is you do it through the curriculums and the courses that you develop. And the way that you do it with students is you impart this skill to them. You begin to evolve that thinking that needs to happen, or we're not going to survive into the next generations. Our system is such that it will recreate itself continually unless we break out of that feedback loop into a new and higher level of thinking. And as I'm looking at all of these mind maps that are being created around us, that's basically what the mind map is. Those mind maps are saying, move to a new feedback loop. And the way we do it is basically through the education process. So I hope, of course, I have done this for many years, so this is old hat for me, but again, I think we have to begin to engage it seriously now, especially at the university level, because the university level teaching of science is part of the problem, not part of the solution.
So should we proceed to questions 3 and 4?
Yeah, I think we are going to,
Yeah.
in the interest of time, and these are big questions, We are not going to resolve them in the next 5 minutes, but you please share, because this discussion will continue. So you please share any thoughts you have on 3 and 4.
Oh,
Let me make mine short. I think question number 3, I think people need to change science. I don't think, we should be pointing at science. I think, it's the people they need to change. I think from an indigenous perspective, science is already giving us enough information right now that can enable us to change, and so we can realize a sustainable future. And from many of our elders, they say that that we live in denial. We need to go beyond that. We need to look at the information that's being provided. We have enough information to make changes. So people need to change, not the science. And so that's my quick answer to that one. And I think as far as incorporating the wisdom, I think indigenous wisdom, as written here, connotes a human wisdom. I think what we're saying here is putting wisdom into science. And when I read that, I said, wow, it's a pretty big challenge, into science or sustainable science. And I don't think there's any one answer. It's, there could be a multiple answer, because this is a very complex question, the way I look at it. And it demands a complex, answer, and I don't think we can talk about this in 5 minutes. And also, whenever you go to indigenous group, we do that all the time. Nancy and I, when we go to Australia, we get different answers because it's a different environment. People think different there because they're of a different land base. So when they talk about sustainability there, it's different from New Zealand when we go to the Maori. And it's different from the people in Hawaii, when we go to our colleagues there. And when we go up into Norway, the Sami people, they give us different answers. Nigeria, when we go to indigenous people there, they give us different answers. So I think, it's that environment, that creates, the complexity and how to talk about indigenous knowledge. And so I think you'll get different answers. And but one thing is, what's common among indigenous group is that wisdom comes from nature's teaching. We say indigenous wisdom. When you ask these indigenous people, they'll say it comes from nature. It comes from nature. And so, it's nature's teaching. And going back to the earlier question, science is telling us enough already. And, we have enough information to make decision. And so whenever you go into these indigenous communities, you ask for deep knowledge, specific knowledge. Today, they're very protective because of the intellectual property right? They've been exploited, many times. And so they're not so openly sharing now. If they're going to share knowledge, they want to be given credit. So you have to deal with those challenges, working with people. And so, you have to just work with those groups.
Okay. Before I open this floor to the people here for question and answer discussions, do you have any last thought? Please.
Okay. If I got to leave you with one word, it would be the concept of balance. In every moment, in all of your life, in all the decisions you make, how could you employ the idea of keeping things in balance, not going too far over this way, not going too far over this way? Nature has that balance. If you study nature, you'll see everything's exquisitely balanced. So that's my word.
I was thinking my word is revolution, but I better not say that in this crowd. No, I think you have to re-engage creative thinking in yourself, and also creative thinking in the students and the programs and the projects that you are a part of. I think our institutions are in a lot of trouble. They're imploding in a variety of different ways. And unfortunately, there's, universities have developed such a culture that it's difficult to be creative anymore in a university. You almost have to be outside the university before you actually do your real work, and that's unfortunate if you're having to be in that situation. So I think that, there's a lot that we can do now as professors, as people who are engaged in this evolving field of sustainability science. If you really study indigenous knowledge systems and you look at the ways that different tribes, operated in their place, you find that it basically was, it was about sustainability all along. It was sustaining the people, the culture, the place through time and through generations for the greatest affect, for the greatest output of life, for life's sake. And that's what Suzuki was saying, and that's a saying that we have as well, for Wotsigi, for life's sake, we do this. And so for the next generations that we impart, and teaching is very much a part of this life's sake process, you see. If you're a teacher, you have that responsibility to share what you know with succeeding generations in ways that, perpetuate life, hopefully, in both individuals and also in the world as a whole. And that's a very indigenous thought once you begin to apply it. So that's what I would leave you with.
I'm touched. Yes to what David said. Yes to what Nancy said in terms of paradox. Yes to what Greg said in terms of breath. My intention in sharing the Aloha Haole story is that in paradox I sit both as Haole, a white guy, and not Haole, Aloha. How do I hold both? And rather than making anybody wrong, how do we actually sit at the table and talk about what sustainability looks like in my field of influence, in our field of influence? Really, that's what I sit with.
I think one last point I wanted to make is my own journey. Greg and I have known each other for a long time. He's been a foundational inspiration and guide in developing the Sustainability Studies program. And at one point I went to him and I said, Greg, how do you think I could recover a sense of being indigenous? Because indigenous people have told us that at one time all of us were indigenous. And I spent about 2 years pondering that, and I didn't want to copy somebody else's indigenousness. I got very sensitive about that, and finally I was struck by the reality that my identity can be traced back to the Caucasus Mountains. I still share genes with people who live there, and they are nomads. They are pastoralists, and they live in yurts. So I went off and I built myself a yurt from scratch. It took about 200 hours, and now it's sort of my little Chautauqua. I take it around to the local food system, and I embed myself as a nomad for a few days, and then I learn and I write. And this has been a big eye-opener, and I invite you to check out my very stale blog. It's called foodshednomad.com, and it documents the yurt and my trips. Foodshednomad.com. So that is my suggestion, is that we educators create environments in which our students can rediscover their indigenousness, however that might be. Because when you engage that way, it's the only way I know to cleanse yourself of all kinds of misconceptions, okay? So, for instance, I, as a Westerner, thought, hey, I'll take my yurt out there and I'll be independent and I'll do my thing. Well, a 56-mile-an-hour wind in the middle of the night for 2 nights in a row shook my little world, and I realized I needed my whole clan with me. I needed a family of people, because it's really about interdependence. So this is phase 2 of the Food Shed Nomad project, is the interdependence and discovering that in a way.
Well, thank you very much, panel, for sharing your ideas on these 4 questions. I'm going to now open up this floor for discussion. I would urge you to follow some guidelines so that most people can get to ask questions. Please limit your question to half a minute. I will be monitoring. If you go half a minute, I will wave that stop. And be very specific what you're asking. Please don't give a talk. I've been observing, so we'll appreciate the time to have a discussion. Okay. Yes, you please. I think I need to get this mic to you.
Hello, my name is Ray Ison from the Open University UK, descended from Europeans who colonized Australia and have, I guess, gone back to Britain, and not quite sure who I am anymore in that regard of who my tribe is. My question comes from the Australian context and as a visitor to the US. I want to ask about foundation myths. And I want to talk about a visit I made to Mount Vernon, George Washington's farm, and how appalled I was to go into the Ford cinema and to see a foundation myth enacted in Hollywood style, which reported on Washington in relation to what were called the French-Indian Wars. And this was done with absolutely no reflexivity about who the war was with and what it was about. And never, and not acknowledged, was the basis of European survival in terms of Thanksgiving. So I think, what do you Indigenous people from the US have to say about the foundation myths of this country?
Well, of course, you know, there's many ways to tell history, and I think the foundation myths are there to, in a sense, perpetuate a view of American culture, and that continues to be a kind of it's kind of connected to Hollywood myths and stories. You know, there's many ways to tell a story. There's many viewpoints of a story, and I think part of the problem has been there has always been only one viewpoint allowed in the context of the storytelling of the histories of the foundations of this nation. So, so I think when we begin to bring some perspective, you know, to history and tell a real history from multiple perspectives, then you gain a better understanding of yourself and your place. I think, you know, in both the United States and Great Britain, we're sort of living around these imagined myths that are almost been, you know, created by a political Hollywood, if you will, that don't have any real foundation in the realities of many people. And so, so we continue to suffer from just one story. And I think that's part of this education, this need for a greater, broader education of our students, to be able to see multiple perspectives, multiple histories, to be exposed to them. And so that would be my thought, you know, with regard to foundational histories.
I just want to say that there's a saying that the victors write the history. And in the case of indigenous people, like, say, example, Navajos, it's really true. When I was teaching, mostly I taught all Navajo students most of my teaching career, and they'd go to the library and come back and they say, what I'm reading isn't what my parents and grandparents are saying. And they could be really specific and say, for example, there was a big massacre in one of the canyons of Canyon de Chelly. It's not the one that's written up. There was another one on the other side, which is very paramount in people's thinking, even consciousness, even today. Because it was Americans that did the killing, it's still almost in no history books. So it is the victors that often write the history, and in the Southwest it was the Spanish. And I think this is why a lot of universities are going in a good direction with an emphasis on diversity and multiple perspectives. And hopefully it will go deep enough so that things you're talking about can be rectified. And the idea, I think we're standing really firmly with that it's positive to have different lenses on the world and different viewpoints. It creates a bigger, more complex, richer, and more accurate history.
Okay, let's see. Yeah, I will get to each one of you.
I think we need to be careful what we call science. The hard sciences or quantitative sciences, they don't care where we came from. Physics doesn't care. So we need to talk about the kind of science you're talking about. If you jump out of a window, no matter what you are, you know what the rules are. So as the soft sciences are being more quantified, we're going to have changes. We're going to have certainties. So be careful on what you use, how you use the word science, and talk about maybe the quantitative and qualitative sciences. And the qualitative sciences are becoming quantitative as we go along. So, give me your opinion on that.
Anybody would like to comment? Okay. We'll just record your question. Third, let's see. Sorry. Right here.
I'm Brett Joseph. I was born and raised in a part of the country here known as the Rust Belt, Cleveland, Ohio. In reference to a post-industrial, the condition of the aftermath of industry, and also a place and people that is really searching for identity. Myself being a European American descendant living in the land of the Seneca and the others from that region. And my question is, as I understand indigenous consciousness as in contrast from separation consciousness from the scientific modern worldview, one big factor has to do with identity, that of being of a people and of a place. And I would be interested in views of any on the panel with regard to what that conversation looks like to be in a genuine multi-ethnic conversation with people that are coming from that journey of separation consciousness to rediscovering identity, of being, who are people as has been expressed by members of the panel, becoming indigenous, gaining that sense of, who I am from a standpoint of a deep history, and then entering into the conversation. What does that conversation look like?
Okay, thank you. Anybody would like to comment on this question?
Just have the conversation. Name that I, each of us, don't look indigenous, and how are we? I wonder about that. How do, in my ignorance, do I connect? How do I become one with as opposed to separate from? Just have the conversation.
Anybody else? Okay, thank you. Yes, please. Okay, I'm losing track.
Kia ora tātou.
Okay, go ahead.
My people are the Te Arawa. Our mountain is Matawhora. Our waters are Te Roto I Te Kiteai e Ihianga. Come from New Zealand. I think my question goes to the crux, perhaps, of what we've been talking about. Indigenous peoples try to operate in conditions of abundance. This society we live in now operates in conditions of scarcity. There seems to be a desire to move from one to the other, and it was suggested earlier that we can just jump from one to the other. I can't see how we can move from scarcity to abundance without becoming sustainable first. Otherwise, we just romanticize this whole idea.
No, I agree with that. Because it's a difficult, really global kind of transformation that has to take place. You begin to look at the systems that are in place right now that either teach for that kind of transformation or don't. Most institutions in the modern world do not. So the question then becomes, how do you begin to reform institutions, especially education, in ways that begin to teach for this movement towards sustainability and then finally movements to abundance. And the change and evolution of this consciousness of what we today are calling indigenous. For me, it's always an education issue. It's always about how you go about creating an educational system and a process and how you teach for this process. And so that I think that for me as a teacher, it really is in how you begin to change education as a whole, beginning first with your locus of influence, but then hopefully through that process beginning to influence others, eventually influencing the whole institution towards a different way of teaching and thinking about what sustainability is, because it is a process. We've moved away from it, largely speaking. We have a few examples historically of indigenous sustainability. Some indigenous sustainability still exists in the world, but in very small pockets. So in a lot of ways, it's an ideal that we're reaching for because of our research and our understanding of what it means to be sustainable in a place, in a context. But it very much is an education issue that has to do with transforming what we are now to where we want to be in the future, and that sustainable future. So again, education, education, education. The 3 E's is what I call it.
Yeah, I don't think it's contingent. I don't think you have to wait for the abundance solution to be arrived at, and then you have permission to live in an abundant framework. I think it's the opposite. I think if you had immediately adopt Gunther Pauli's worldview of abundance, just drink the Kool-Aid, go into the classroom with that frame, and then teach accordingly. And then you'll be doing it. And that's his word, do it. And then your students will do it. I guarantee they will do it. Because right now they don't have a model. They don't have a framework for how to live in the abundant frame. So I think just do it.
Well, I think it's education too, and I have a lot of faith in the young people of today. And I think we have to, it's up to all of us to provide a foundation for them to be able to live in this coming world that we can't imagine. I think probably I'm going out on a limb with this, but I think teacher education institutions have to radically change. And I was working at this school district called Shanto, way out on the western side of the Navajo Nation, and I was invited, and I was in charge of teacher education and professional development at that time, and so I was invited to speak at Northern Arizona University in their to the indigenous people in their teacher education department. And the first thing I asked them when I got there was, have you had indigenous people come and speak to you? And they'd been there for several years. They said, you're the first one that's ever come. And to me, that is just insane, because they were all Navajo, and they were going to go back and teach Navajo students. So this was quite a few years ago, and I don't know what's changed. But I just had the great experience of teaching under tall Douglas fir trees, on the underneath them, sitting on the ground on an island with about 30 students who were from Canada and from Western Washington and University of Victoria, and they're in something called the Redfish School of Change. They are astonishing. Now, there wasn't one native face in the whole group, but they are totally committed to change. And we sat around for 3 hours and talked about what makes change. People used to ask me what I did, and now, like Greg just mentioned that word revolution, I loved it. And I've known him for about 25 years. This is good to hear. I now say I'm in the business of changing the world. Because I think the messages that are floating around this room need to get to the younger people, because they're the ones that are going to have to do something with this. We have some knowledge, but they're the ones that are going to have to really act. So it's up to us to look at these big institutions, think globally, think of institutional change, but act very locally and do whatever you can, even as an individual, to make these things happen.
Let me talk about my experience with the university. I realized that the language and the worldview I was raised with was really different from the Euro-American Cartesian, Newtonian-based methods of teaching, and that there's no way it could be put together, not within the time frame that I had to learn. And so, I had to just completely switch over to scientific thinking. And I went to the laboratory, and I acted like I was a scientist and talked the language, and I don't even think native one bit. Got good grades, and same thing with going into my trigonometry class and physics, and same thing. And I talked to other people, professors, native people, and they tell me they did the same thing. I know of a physicist teacher who's from Hopi. He's raised with the language, a physics teacher, and full professor at the university. And when he goes back home, he's completely Hopi. The language he was raised in, no sign of him being a scientist, professor. Completely cultural activities, takes part in all the cultural activities and spiritual activities. And then goes back to the university and act like everybody else, talk the language. I think a lot of Native people, they did this, and I did that. And so, but I always knew, there's also another way of looking at the world. And if I use my native language, that some of the earlier conversation we had, if I was to go into, a place, a group of people, and I say, I am of the universe, people, probably raise their eyes, so you just don't, but with the right people, the right environment, you can do these things, I think. But I had some great dialogues with people from all over the world. And they were really interested in some of this knowledge. One of them was a visit from Brian Josephson. He was a physicist and a Nobel Prize recipient in physics in Cambridge. And he called me one day and said, "I want to come and visit you. Can we have some time together? I want a dialogue, not a quick conversation. I want like 2 days. Can I get it from you?" So we did. So he brought a rock. So this is what I want to talk about. Will be our point of contact. How do you talk about that? And this is how science, would talk about it. Some of the different ways of, looking at it. Going back to the old science, to know the word, the old science when it was first born, how it was used. And then the different kinds of science, how it's defined, including the quantum science and wholeness science, different definition in how they all mean different things. So we had a great dialogue. And so what he came for, he tells me, I got it. This is what I really wanted. I wanted to hear it from a native person. So we had some really great dialogues. And so if you set aside the time, you can have some great conversation and, really going into the deep knowledge, of the indigenous mind. It's there. It's very intellectual, very deep. And so it's just, it's suppressed all these years.
Thank you. Okay. Next, you were asking. And then 1, 2, 3.
Yeah, we only have about 3 minutes.
We have three quick questions. The three of you. Please limit your statement to 15 seconds. So
Okay, who?
Respond. Yeah. Go ahead.
Sue Gabriel. I was an ESL teacher for 20 years in Los Angeles, junior high school and high school. And I noticed that in a high school where we had 85 different languages from all the cultures. And I noticed in my early years that some of my students came in feeling inferior to native English speakers. Other groups came in feeling superior. And so I learned to encourage them to love themselves, whichever language they spoke. Love yourself as an English speaker. Love yourself as a Spanish speaker or a Vietnamese speaker. That's how I ended up, if you have any comments.
Thank you. Any comments or a question?
Yeah, I'll try to make this brief. A couple historical comments. When you were talking about the relationship between Hopi and physics, the linguist Benjamin Lee Whorf back in the 1940s pointed out that the structure of the Hopi language is actually more conducive, more parallel to the structure of modern physics than Indo-European languages are. And when you were talking about acknowledging indigenous knowledge, one of the things I'd like to acknowledge, I was talking about this to my colleague the other day, that Margaret Mead and Gregory Bateson were both very significant figures in this organization and in the development of second-order cybernetics. And I don't think it's any accident that they both lived and worked in the Pacific. And all of us, I'm an anthropologist also, and all of us who have worked in the Pacific, found our conception of like the independent notion of the person challenged and live through the experience of interdependency. So I also want to acknowledge the contribution of the Samoans and the Chambri and the Yatmul to this organization and to systems thinking.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We're actually out of time.
The last question.
We have to leave in 1 minute.
The very last question.
Yes.
Please be quick.
Yes. I'm a systemic product. I have mixed blood and mixed culture. So I wonder, in our new small tribe, systemic tribe, these are new cultures, combinations of values, of experiences, and everything. What is going to happen with this systemic tribe?
Thank you. Maybe we can answer also outside of the room because we really need to leave the room.
Yeah.
So
I think we are going to...
Unfortunately, yes, we must leave. Thank you so much, and thank you for being here too. Thank you. Thank you so much.